Welcome back to Nonfiction for Life, the podcast with authors who write compelling true stories and books with great ideas for living well. I'm your host, Janet Perry. We are very excited to have new listeners. We had a great response to last week's podcast with Liz Wiseman talking about her book, Multipliers. We welcome all of you who are new to the podcast, and we invite you to leave a review where you can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, and now on Google Play. Also, if you have books that you want to hear about or authors that you'd like to hear from, leave us a message. You can email us at feedback@nonfictionforlife or just post something on any of our social media channels. We're on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. We'd love to hear from you. Last week's book, Multipliers by Liz Wiseman, we put in the category of business and entrepreneurship. We could put this week's book in the same category, but we've decided to put it under personal development. And I think you'll see why after you listen to our author, Brad Agle. Let me first introduce him to you and then tell you about his book. Brad Agle is the George W. Romney Endowed Professor and Professor of Ethics and Leadership at the BYU Marriott School of Business. He serves on multiple boards and committees, and he's on the editorial board of the Business Ethics Quarterly. His writings appear in the top academic journals in management and ethics and are highly cited and frequently featured in prominent news outlets. He's a recipient of multiple research and teaching awards, including Distinguished Professor of the Year. He's provided board and executive trainings for many organizations across the world, including Alcoa, Federated Investors, Mellon Financial, U.S. Steel, and U.S. Marine Corps. He's been a guest on various programs, including CNBC's Morning Call, Power Lunch, and Closing Bell. He and his wife, Christy, have 4 children and 6 grandchildren. Together with his co-authors, Aaron Miller and Bill O'Rourke, Brad Agle has written the book, The Business Ethics Field Guide, the essential companion to leading your career and your organization to greatness. And we are delighted to have him on our program today. Welcome, Dr. Agle, to Nonfiction for Life. Thank you for being with us today.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I've introduced your book, The Business Ethics Field Guide, and I'd love you to share with our audience why you named it a field guide.
Sure. So as we were thinking about what our guidebook does, or what this book that we're writing would help people with, we kind of basically said, going out into the professional world, whether the business world or nonprofit world, it's kind of like going out into the wilderness where you've never been before. There are going to be new experiences. There's a lot of exciting things in that world. There are going to be, mountaintops and wonderful views of waterfalls. But there are also dangers, things that you have not thought about or encountered before. When you go into the wilderness, you're going to face, animals and cliffs and other kinds of things. And so we just thought it was kind of a fun metaphor to think about the professional world in that same way, where there are lots of exciting experiences you're going to have, but at the same time, we know that there are lots of, dangers and things that you're going to have to deal with that you weren't necessarily prepared to deal with. And so when you go into the wilderness, you take a field guide. When you go into the professional world, here's a field guide for you.
That makes a lot of sense, particularly when it comes to ethics. You never know what's going to come at you. I'd also like you to talk about your subtitle, The Essential Companion to Leading Your Career and Your Organization to Greatness. There's an assumption there that there's greatness to come if we apply ethics well. So how can you make the connection between ethical behavior and how it leads to greatness?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for asking that question. So we actually talk about ethics as a leadership skill, and it's a critical leadership skill. Abe Zalesnik in 1977 wrote an article in the Harvard Business Review in which he talked about different kinds of leadership. In fact, he differentiated between leadership and management. And he said, to leadership is about creating vision, it's about inspiring people, it's about creating change, and that's necessary for organizations. And management is about creating stability. It's about budgeting. It's about planning, and you need that kind of stability as well. What we're suggesting in this book is there's another type of leadership skill, and that's the ability to articulate values and to deal with times when there are value conflicts. And there are lots of value conflicts in the business world and in other professional settings. And so, we're talking about this as a companion to leading your career and organization to success, because you will be much more successful in your career, and your organizations will be much more successful if you've developed the skills that we're talking about.
I think that approach to ethics, developing skills, is unique. I really don't know if other people have done that. And let's talk about this book that you've structured it so that each chapter, well, several of the 13 of the chapters contain ethical dilemmas. For example, standing up to power, making a promise, suspicions without enough evidence, skirting the rules, and so forth. And each one of these you deal with individually. Would you consider that violating any of these particular ethics is more serious than others, or are they on a continuum, or do they each stand alone?
So I think it's first important to differentiate ethical dilemmas from ethical issues. So this is not a book about ethical issues. And by that I mean, should you steal from your employer? Should you create unsafe working environments so you can make lots of money? Those things are, in my mind, not particularly ethical dilemmas. Those are just wrong. And so our book is not about things that are wrong. Our book is about where there are genuine difficulties in terms of, what am I going to do in this situation, and how do I deal with it? So my experience, this book actually comes out of my experience teaching executive MBAs. So I've been teaching executive MBAs now for almost 20 years. When I was at the University of Pittsburgh, I taught executive MBAs. We had 3 programs, one in Pittsburgh, one in Sao Paulo, Brazil, and one in Prague in the Czech Republic. And my students' first assignment is to write up some ethical dilemma that they have faced in their career. And so I've collected hundreds and hundreds of these dilemmas over the years. And of course, now I teach executive MBAs at BYU. And over the years, these I can tell you, these ethical dilemmas they come up with are challenging. They're not the variety of, should I embezzle? Should I, pay a bribe? They tend to be the kind where it's like, gosh, that's really difficult. I'm not sure what's the right thing to do here. Or I think I know what's the right thing, but boy, I don't know how to deal with this. And so that's really what our book is about. It's for people who really want to do the right thing, but are, faced with difficult dilemmas. So back to your question then, there's not really a hierarchy in terms of seriousness. It's more each of these is kind of standalone. So these dilemmas that you just discussed, they come out of a research project. There are 3 of us who authored this book, myself, Bill O'Rourke, and Aaron Miller. And Aaron asked me a few years ago about the research I was doing, and I mentioned different projects, and I mentioned that I had noticed that there were patterns in these ethical dilemmas from my executive MBA students, and that I was starting to create questions and solutions to help with particular types of ethical dilemmas, at which point he said, well, how many are there? And I said, well, I don't know. No one's done that. So he said, well, let's do it. So we did. So we basically did a research project where we looked at all these ethical dilemmas to try to find out, in terms of variety and specificity, there's all kinds of ethical dilemmas. You could never possibly imagine all the different kinds of things people end up dealing with. But when you boil them down to what's the fundamental issue that the person is dealing with, we went through that process and we came up with the 13 fundamental dilemmas that people are going to face in their professional lives.
And you do such a great job in each book being preemptive, helping people be preemptive. You offer advice and strategies like you call planning ahead. And I was really struck by how often you suggested two of the same things: building social capital and taking time. Tell us why friends and time are so important to becoming ethical.
So the social capital notion is this idea that we can talk about financial capital. We've got money, and that can be helpful. There's other kinds of capital in terms of our skills. We call those human capital. Social capital is this idea that you've developed relationships with others over time that is valuable. So, for example, I've worked with a lot of executives over the years, and now if I need something, I can oftentimes go to them and they'll answer my phone because they know who I am. I've done things for them in the past. So there's a sense of reciprocity that you can draw on. And oftentimes when people find themselves in difficult situations, you need to be able to draw on that social capital. You need to be able to um, I'll just give you one example. One of my former executive MBAs was in a really difficult situation. He had worked for one of the big three, and then automakers, and then he went to Mexico, and he found himself in a very difficult situation where the CEO of the company he was working for wasn't living up to commitments to one of their customers. And this student of mine was the one who had made the sale and had made the commitments, and now they weren't being able to live up to the commitment because his CEO wouldn't allow it. It was a money issue. They just didn't have the capital. Well, this particular student had built a relationship with a top executive in another company, actually one of the big three automakers, and he really didn't know what to do. And so he called up this executive and said, what should I do? I'm in this real bind. And this executive said, oh, this is not a problem. You just have a cash flow issue. I can get you a line of credit easily. It'll be done by the end of the day. And by the end of the day, he had gotten him a line of credit, and the problem was solved. And this person said, I had no idea what I was going to do, but because I had built up this relationship, I was able to draw on that. And the thing about social capital is you can't create it when you need it. You have to create it before you need it. And that's, sometimes it's just advice, but sometimes, particularly in situations where there's someone in power in relationship to you who's asking you or telling you to do something you don't think is right, boy, you really need resources. And again, those resources can't be built at the time that you need them. They have to be built before you need those resources. So that's the importance of social capital. And then the other one you mentioned is taking time. Oftentimes when we are faced with ethical dilemmas, it seems like we have to react immediately and we have to do something right now. What we know from research in psychology is when people are under pressure, when there's a lot of stress, we tend to not make particularly good decisions. There's sort of the old notion of fight or flight, and cognitive science says that we're not at our best when we're under severe stress and time pressure. So the first thing we tell people is, if you can, and you can't always, but most of the time you can, build a little bit of time in, because if you build a little bit of time, that gives you the opportunity to talk to other people about it, because other people oftentimes will give you perspectives that are very helpful. They're not as emotionally involved, and sometimes when you're not as emotionally involved, you can give a better, more objective perspective on somebody's problem.
Those are really good things to remember. Several times you propose that we consider how our decisions or actions will affect others. In other words, you suggest doing the least harm to all. So what might that look like, say, in the middle of an ethical dilemma you call intervention?
Yeah, so ethics, you just basically define what ethics is about. So fundamentally, ethics is about how we treat other people. And so I always say there's two dimensions when we think about ethics. The first one, which we tend to focus a lot on people when we talk about ethics, is in a sense getting your heart right, or getting to the place where you care about other people. Because if you don't care about other people, anything else we say about ethics really doesn't matter. Fundamentally, you have to care about other people, because that's what ethics is about, how you treat other people. So that's kind of the first side. And then the second side, which is the one that we're focusing on in this book, is, okay, that's great. Once you've got your heart right, there are also skills involved. And so you need to develop those skills in order to be able to actually enact what your heart wants you to do, and to do it in an effective way. So you just asked me about the intervention dilemma. Intervention dilemma is where you're not necessarily being asked or told to do something, but you see something, or you're somehow tangentially involved in a situation, and you then have to decide, should I get involved? Should I do something? I'm seeing something I think is wrong. If I get involved, how should I get involved? And that actually gives us another opportunity to talk about social capital. Oftentimes, you are perhaps not the right person. You don't have the position or the power to actually do something, but maybe you have a relationship with somebody else that you can go to and say, I'm seeing this. And oftentimes those other people then maybe can deal with a situation that you can't necessarily deal with. Intervention is a tricky one. I guess these are all tricky, but it's tricky in that sometimes you're the right person to intervene. Sometimes you're not the right person to intervene. Sometimes sometimes there are hills you shouldn't try to take. So there are things you see that are going on that you say that's probably not right, but there are times where, well, that may be the case, but it's probably not the right time or the right situation for you necessarily to get involved.
What I liked is in the book, you help the reader go through a 360 and decide if he or she is the right person, or if it is the right time, rather than just throw up hands and say, well, I'm not directly involved, I don't have to deal with it. You make it very clear that ethical situations, whether we are directly or indirectly involved, are our business. And then we make decisions there with that construct. So I think that's a very honest approach to ethics. So let's keep going. You name conflicts of interest as the most frequently excused dilemma in the business world. More than any other dilemma, you say in your book, this one invokes the argument, that's just how business is done. So what are some of the common pitfalls associated with this dilemma, and how can we avoid getting enmeshed in them?
I first got involved with conflicts of interest when I was asked by the Oncology Nursing Society, which is the professional association for like 35,000 oncology nurses, to come in and help them think about conflict of interest issues. So they happen to be headquartered in Pittsburgh, and so they called me and said, we have a couple of for-profit entities and a couple of nonprofit entities, and we are finding that we have conflicts, and we're trying to figure out how to deal with them. And so I spent a bunch of time with them, helping them think through their conflict of interest issues and their policies. And then over the years, I found myself in other situations thinking about and training people about conflict of interest. There was a really high-profile case with the Air Force and the head of procurement for the Air Force having a big conflict of interest together with the CFO of Boeing, and they both ended up going to jail for it. And so the Marine Corps had me come in and help them think through conflict of interest issues. And I've just seen a lot of them since. The first pitfall, and I think the reason that so many people don't recognize, and that's really the biggest issue, they don't recognize when there's a conflict of interest, is because when we hear the term conflict of interest, we think bad. To have a conflict of interest is a bad thing. And in one respect, that's correct. But what I try to help people understand is the simple act or the simple fact of having a conflict of interest is not a bad thing. In fact, I tell my students to embrace their conflicts of interest, to find their conflict of interest. The reason I say that is because the only people in the world who don't have any conflicts of interest are people who have no interest. As soon as you've got family, friends, you're involved in different things, you're going to find that you have conflicts of interest. So I tell my students, look for them. The first time you see one, pat yourself on the back. You've now become important enough to have a conflict of interest. And generally, the more involved you are, the more important, quite frankly, you are, the more conflicts of interest you're going to have. So the first thing you have to do is get out of your mind that having a conflict of interest is bad. It's not. It generally says something positive about you. The problem is that we don't recognize and therefore don't manage them well. So if you recognize you have an ethical issue, then you go, okay, now what do I need to do to deal with that issue? Because there are things you should manage. There are times when you have to excuse yourself from having a particular role because the conflict is too great. Other times, if you just disclose so everybody knows, that's a good enough solution. And other times the conflict is so small that everybody goes, yeah, fine. Yep, you got that conflict. But it's really important just to get it out on the table. So I'll give you an example of several of these where people did not recognize they even had an ethical dilemma. So I serve on the ethics committee of USA Synchro, which is the U.S. Olympic Committee for Synchronized Swimming. Long story of how I got involved. I was never a synchronized swimmer. So before the last Olympics, the way the 8 young women who were chosen for the synchronized swimming team, our Olympic team, they're a group of finalists, about 25 finalists, and they go to a competition and compete for the 8 spots on the Olympic team. Well, there have to be judges. And so before the last Olympics, the organization requested that the ethics committee basically look at the judges to make sure that this would be a fair process. And so we asked for all the potential judges to send us a conflict of interest form. And so they all sent those in, and as an ethics committee, our ethics committee consisted of 2 of us who were ethics experts and 2 who were former Olympic synchronized swimmers. So we're going through the forms, and there weren't really any significant problems, and so I'm thinking, okay, we're good. But then one of the former Olympic swimmers said, wait a second, this particular potential judge, her sister is one of the finalists for one of those 8 slots. And she didn't put that down. And we went to another one, and then she said, oh, wait a second. This particular potential judge is the coach of one of the potential team members. At which point we had to stop our meeting and said, wait a second, these folks apparently don't have any idea what conflict of interest is. So then we had to redo the process, and this time we actually put a set of examples of what a conflict of interest is. So we said, for example, if your relative is a finalist, that's a conflict of interest. If you're the coach of one of the finalists, that's a conflict of interest. Then we did the process again. Guess what? Now every one of our potential judges had a conflict of interest. Because it's a very small community. Anytime you get a very small community, the probabilities you're going to have conflict of interest. Because you have to have people who are expert, we had to have some folks who had conflicts of interest, but we were able to find people who only had minor conflicts of interest. For example, someone says, I was a coach of one of the finalists when she was in third grade. Okay, great. So you know her, when she was in third grade, but that's not a big conflict of interest. She's not your sister. You're not her current coach. So, people just want to avoid conflict of interest. They just want to think that they don't have them.
Well, it sounds like the first step then is awareness. And if you can become aware of them, then you can be more honest about them should an ethical situation arise.
That really is the big thing. Let me just tell you one other quick story about that. So when Bill O'Rourke, my co-author, was head of a whole bunch of areas at Alcoa, one of which was over medical. He had a medical director who got married. And this medical director came back from his honeymoon, and he went and saw Bill, and of course, how was the wedding, etc. And he said, it was great. Dr. So-and-so and Dr. So-and-so both gave me a $2,000 wedding present. Isn't that nice? And Bill said, well, both of those doctors are contractors with Alcoa. So some people might see it that you invited these two suppliers to your wedding, both of whom gave you a $2,000 kickback. And this guy said, no, they've been friends of mine for a long time. They just, out of the goodness of our heart, were giving me a wedding present. Yeah, well, that's one way of viewing it, but a lot of people might look at that and go, boy, $2,000 in cash, and you're the one who decides whether or not to hire them for Alcoa. That can look a lot like a kickback. So they just, some people, and again, this is a really smart person. This is not a poorly educated person. This is an MD, very well educated, and just didn't even see the possibility that could be seen as something other than just an honest gift.
Well, I'm glad you brought up Bill O'Rourke. He peppers your books with really fun, interesting stories, real life stories about ethical dilemmas. Maybe you can tell us the story of him dealing with the dilemma of the unfair advantage.
He was headed on a flight back to Pittsburgh, which is where Alcoa is headquartered, and it's the typical airport. You've got chairs that are back to each other, and he sat down and kind of put his stuff out and got his computer out, and he started hearing the conversation that was happening behind him. There were 4 executives from Anheuser-Busch, and they were discussing their upcoming negotiation for the canned sheet contract with Alcoa, which is the biggest contract that Alcoa signs every year. So lots of money involved. And Bill heard this conversation, and it just so happens a friend of his is head of the canned sheet division at Alcoa. So he thought, well, this is really interesting information. Of course, they were about to get on the plane with him to go to Pittsburgh to have this negotiation. And so he then says, I have this advantage. In a sense, it's unfair because, they probably shouldn't be discussing this in a public place. However, they don't necessarily know there's somebody listening. So he said, so the dilemma is, what do I do? Do I go ahead and turn on my recorder and record what they're saying? Do I take notes? Do I leave? What do I do? I'm in this situation where I think I've got an advantage, but a lot of people would consider that to be an unfair advantage. So what he did is he stood up, he got their attention, and he said, hi, I'm Bill O'Rourke from Alcoa. I'm Bill O'Rourke from Alcoa, to each of the 4 executives, thinking, okay, I've let them know that they're talking to somebody from the other side of the table, in essence. They all sat down. They continued talking. Bill says, well, then what? Have I fulfilled my responsibility? Do I now have a responsibility to my organization? It's an interesting dilemma. He discusses it with my students a lot, and some of the students say, you just need to walk away. He said in his perspective was, I gave them notice. I did my duty. And so he actually went ahead and took notes
Hmm.
and then called his friend and said, "Hey, I just heard this interesting conversation." He said the interesting thing for him was that his friend said, "Did you tell them who you were?" And he said, "Yes, I introduced myself to them." He said, "Okay." So they went ahead and used that information.
Fair enough then. You in the book you make a distinction between laws and rules, and I'm not sure we think about that very much. Maybe you can tell us how they differ and what we should know about them in regards to ethics.
Laws, of course, are mandated or enforced by power and law enforcement. Um, and when we talk about laws and ethics, there is a large overlap between the two, but it's not a complete overlap. There are times where people do things that are illegal but are ethical. So you think about Martin Luther King Jr., for example. Several of the things that he did were illegal, but we look at it and say, yeah, but he absolutely did the right thing. So there's not a complete overlap between the two. Fortunately, there is generally a large overlap, but not a complete overlap. Now, you said you talked about a distinction between laws and rules. Rules are generally created by organizations, laws, obviously, by a legislature. And so the rules, most organizations have rules. And really, it's very difficult for any kind of organization of any size to function effectively without rules. And that's the reason that organizations create them. However, it's very difficult to ever imagine all the different kinds of things that could possibly happen. And so oftentimes people are faced with a situation where they're trying to do the right thing. They're not trying to do something wrong. They're trying to do the right thing. They're trying to get important work done, but the organizational rules are getting in the way. They're trying to figure out how to get around a rule that the organization has set up that actually blocks them from being able to get the organization's work done or meeting the organization's goals. And so that's the reason one of the dilemmas we talk about is called skirting the rules. Is it ever okay to skirt the rules? In general, not. But there are certain circumstances where you probably actually do need to figure out a way around the rules. But those, one has to be very careful in going around rules. But there are certain situations where that is the right thing to do.
This just really underscores the importance of having a field guide, because it seems to me from everything you're saying that we really do need to take these situations one on one and deal with them in the most ethical way we know how. And we do need skills. You do talk about different working definitions for ethics, and you say as authors that you really like the virtue ethics. So maybe you can explain what that is, or if we're operating under those kind of ethics, what kind of questions we'll be asking ourselves when we face dilemmas.
Sure. Before I do that, let me go back to the skirting of the rules one, just to give one quick illustration.
Sure.
So one of the stories we tell in the book is a story of a situation where a client of this company, the most important client of this company, needed something from the company. And the organization had a rule that one of the three founders had to approve that particular type of action. In this case, one of the principals was on a vacation completely out of communication. Another happened to be on an international flight, in the middle of an international flight, out of communication. And the third one had a significant medical event and was being rushed to the hospital. And so this person was faced with, okay, the rules say one of those three has to say yes, but basically they're all three in some, incapacitated, and our most important client needs this thing. And he was very nervous about this, but he one of the rules we talk about is, would those who created the rule want you to break that rule?
Hmm.
And he thought about that particular question, and he said, he had worked with these three principles for years and years. And he said, knowing those three, knowing the circumstance, knowing the client, those three principles would want me to break this rule right now.
Hmm.
And so he went ahead and broke it, still was nervous about it, got the customer what they wanted, and then, when the others came back and they all said, good job, you did the right thing.
Interesting.
So you don't want to do it very often, but there are times, and some of the questions we ask in the book help one think about that. Now, you just asked me about virtue ethics. So in one of the chapters of the book, we do what is kind of Ethics 101, where we talk about the different philosophical approaches to help us think about what's the right thing to do. In fact, I have 2 pages in the book that I call 3,000 Years of Philosophy and Theology boiled down to 1 page. And in that page, we discuss notions of rights, duties, justice, utilitarianism, which is doing the thing that creates the greatest good, ethics of care, and then virtue ethics. And virtue ethics stems back to as far back as Aristotle. Virtue ethics asks us to pose the question when we are faced with an ethical dilemma: what action is in accord with the type of person I want to be? So I'm faced with this dilemma. I'm trying to be a certain kind of person. Would this particular action or a different action be in concert with or promote the type of person that I want to be? So, for folks who are Christian, you think, what kind of action would lead me to be more like Jesus Christ? That's a virtue perspective.
That makes it easier in some ways to answer the questions that face us. Before we go, I just have a couple more questions. Are you seeing any troubling ethical trends on the horizon that we haven't seen before that we should be aware of? Are these age-old troubles that everyone's had to deal with?
I always tell people that 7 deadly sins are not going away anytime soon. So I don't worry too much about my job security. I'd teach leadership, I'd teach strategy. I'd love to be able to teach those and not have to worry about ethics, but I don't think that's going to happen. In fact, oftentimes we simply see the same things coming up. They're just cyclical. A lot of the things we see, you go back in history, it's like, yep, we've had that before. And we'll try to regulate, but then sometimes what's interesting is sometimes we deregulate to just have the exact same problem happen again. But other times, ethics are based on changing technology. So, probably the biggest ethical issue facing us today is the rise of information and technology. Privacy, we think about how in the world can we possibly keep things private anymore. We've got issues of technology creating situations where a lot of people are going to be losing jobs. But again, that's not new, right? We've had technology, the tractor, once upon a time, 97% of Americans were farmers. Mm-hmm. That was disrupted, because now we've just flipped it. Now 3%. Actually, we may be down to 2% of Americans are farmers now. But there's disruptive technology, and it creates these ethical issues. Well, what are these people going to do for work? And there are a lot of people who are worried that employment's going to become very difficult with the new technology. I don't actually think that's going to be a big problem. I look at history and go, Yeah, we figured out how to create new work when we have these technology disruptions. But another really fascinating area of ethics is when we now make automated decisions, we actually have to program in the ethics, as opposed to a human being in the situation now deciding. We can actually look at the situation before it ever happens and actually program in. Now, the best example of that is automated cars. So there are a lot of people who are dealing with the question of, if this situation arises where, for example, I've got to either run my car into a brick wall, which will kill me, or swerve to the right that will kill 5 pedestrians. What should I do? Again, today, it's just kind of a split-second human decision. But with an automated car, you actually have to program in what it should do. That's a tough thing to think about, and to actually make the decision before it ever happens that I'm going to either swerve the car into a wall and kill myself, or I'm going to swerve it into those 5 pedestrians and kill those 5 pedestrians and save myself. So that's kind of a fascinating issue that is a new one.
Yeah, you've found some uncharted territory in ethics. Well, the last thing I want to mention is that each of your dilemma chapter ends with a practice dilemma that encourages companies and individuals with power to implement a code of ethics, or at least to talk about it and practice skills. So if any of our listeners are interested in using the book this way, is there anything that you'd like to let them know about that?
Thank you for asking that question. I've done a lot of training in organizations, and I find that the most effective training is when I ask people to come with their own dilemmas. So, I can bring, because I have lots and lots of, hundreds and hundreds of dilemmas from students and other places. But if the people can bring their own dilemmas, then what we can do is we can then say, okay, well, which of these 13 dilemmas is it? So we can read one of their dilemmas, and generally we can say, oh, this is an intervention dilemma, or this is a conflict of interest, or this is a whether or not to provide mercy dilemma. And then we could go to the field guide and go, okay, what guidance would the field guide give to helping us think through this or act through this particular dilemma? And I found that to be very effective. People find that to be really helpful, and they come away from that kind of experience going, okay, I now have confidence that I can actually face a dilemma and not just, as you said earlier, throw my hands up and say, who knows? But I actually have some tools that will at least, some of these are really hard. I'm not suggesting that, there's a simple solution. But at least they say, I've got some tools that can help me think through how to act in a way that will be effective in this difficult situation.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to put the book together. We thank your other authors as well, Aaron Miller and Bill O'Rourke, and we appreciate you being on the program today.
Thank you very much, Janet. It was great to be with you.
You've been listening to Brad Agle, one of the co-authors of the Business Ethics Field Guide, the essential companion to leading your career and your organization to greatness. Be sure to join us next week when we talk to author and NFL MVP Steve Young discuss his memoir, QB, My Life Behind the Spiral. If you like what you heard today, be sure to go to our website, nonfictionforlife.com, and subscribe to the email list. We'll send podcasts and blog posts directly to your inbox. You can count on all our books being insightful, inspiring, and uplifting. You can also subscribe directly to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, and Google Play. Thank you for listening to the Nonfiction for Life podcast. I'm your host, Janet Perry. Remember, at Nonfiction for Life, we believe there's something for everyone. We'll talk to you next time.